Hi, everybody. Today's January 10th, 2024, and I'm honored to have the erudite, articulate, well-written, prodigious Michael Walsh.
Well, thanks for having me on, Randy. I mean, for briefly, I grew up in the United States Marine Corps, so I moved around a lot as a boy. We were stationed in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where I was born, San Diego, California, Honolulu, Hawaii. Came back, went to college in Rochester, New York, after doing a stint in D.C., lived in San Francisco, Los Angeles. I work in Hollywood still to this day. Let's see, where else have I lived? Munich, West Germany. Well, all over Europe, of course. London, Moscow during the Soviet period. Pretty much basic peripatetic writer's life. I was the music critic of Time magazine from 1981 to around 1996 or 7. So in the course of those duties, I would go all over the world to attend concerts and write about them for the magazine, which was in the last of its glory days at that point. So we had enormous budgets and we had a great writing staff, and it was an honor to be part of that. And since then, I write novels, I write nonfiction books. I've got my 17th book in the bag, and I got numbers 18 and 19 coming out this year, 24, and early 25. So I've been busy.
So can we talk about 18, 19, and 17, perhaps? Which of yours you feel is your favorite? And and what is your, let's talk about the kind of cultural criticism ones. How prognosticative, predictive have they been?
Yeah, which one are we talking about now? The Devil's Leisure Palace, or?
Well, I was using your numerology. The prospective books you might touch on. Like what are your ideas in mind right now? What vein are you pursuing? Novels, criticism, politics?
Yeah, well, one of them is a collection of essays. So I commissioned them and edited them and wrote one myself, and it's called Against the Corporate Media. And it's a follow-up to our book Against the Great Reset, which came out 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in this case, I've got 42 essays from mostly journalists attacking the corporate shill media and the partisan fascist adjacent media, shall we call them, since they're in partnership with the Democrat Party and the government. There's Great Reset now. It's an attack on all of that. The Great Reset was an attack on Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, and you can see the list of very distinguished writers we got to join us on that crusade. And this new one will have shorter essays, more of them, and we'll hit the media high and we'll hit the media low. So that's that project. And then the book that is now headed into the copy editing stage for Macmillan is called Rage, R-A-G-E. And rage is the first word in Homer's Iliad, meaning. And it is a sequel, in a way, to my book Last Stands, which you should find there on Amazon as well. Last Stands was an enormous hit, surprise hit for Macmillan 3 or 4 years ago, and they've been after me to do another military history book, a battles book again. So this book is called Rage, and it's 12 battles that changed the course of Western history. So Last Stands was why men fight when all is lost, and it was what you think it is. It was a book about various famous last stands throughout history, like Thermopylae, the Greeks at Thermopylae, or Custer at the Little Bighorn, or the Alamo, and some you've never heard of, but I found interesting to write about. One of them was Hastings, and one of them was Shiloh, which would have ended certainly the career of both Grant and Sherman had the Union lost that battle. It was an early Civil War battle, and the Nationals, as they sometimes called themselves, the Federals, took a tremendous beating from the Confederates in the opening day of that battle. It lasted 2 days, and then they rallied. Grant rallied, and they won it on the second day. So anyway, Rage is about epical battles that literally changed the course of history overnight. And each one is considered in great detail. Some of the chapters are 20 or 25,000 words long. One, for example, is about the French Norman Italian, because he was living in Italy at the time when he joined the First Crusade, Bohemond, and his fights at Dourlane and Antioch during the First Crusade. The whole chapter is about First Crusade, but it's really about religion. It's about the rise of Christianity, the simultaneous rise of rabbinic Judaism, just at the same time of Christ, and the rise of the Roman Empire, which is exactly contemporaneous to both of those events. And so I tracked the notion of religiosity through in a chapter on Constantine, who made Christianity legalized throughout the Roman Empire in the early 4th century and into the Crusades. And so I think that'll offend everybody. I hope so. I've tried. Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, come on in. You'll all come in for a certain amount of hiding in this chapter. What else did I write about? I wrote a big chapter on World War II, which is largely framed around George Patton, who fought as a tank commander in World War I under Blackjack Pershing. And then, of course, his finest hour was at the Battle of the Bulge, which happens, because history rhymes, to have taken place just about the same place that the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, which Patton fought in the First World War, took place. That is, in that part of eastern France near the Belgian border, near the Ardennes forest. I was struck by that, and of course I was struck by Patton. There's a chapter on Napoleon. I haven't seen the new movie yet because I'm living in remote rural Ireland at the moment. There's no movie theaters around for quite a ways, but I'll catch up to it eventually. Anyway, I spent a lot of time with that chapter on Napoleon, and this gets back to your question about cultural stuff. I did Napoleon at Austerlitz because everybody considers that his greatest tactical masterpiece, and it is. And it also relates to other battles, going all the way back to Alexander at Gaugamela when he defeated the Persians for the third and final time. I linked throughout the book how one battle is like another battle, so that when Bohemond finds himself caught in Antioch, that he's just taken, but now he's surrounded by a vengeful Turkish coalition army. I point out that he's very much like Caesar at Alesia at this point, so caught between two walls. And Caesar at Alesia was the final battle against the Celtic Gauls, and Vercingetorix, their commander. So it all relates. But the Napoleon chapter is really about not so much Napoleon the commander as Napoleon the Lebenskünstler, as we say in German, which is an artist of life. And he was his impact on Europe. Forget the military part, but forget the fact that he scared the bejesus out of the Europeans for 15 years until finally they put paid to him at Waterloo. But on the psyche of young men, I'm very concerned with the fate of young men today, because masculinity is a gift in short supply, shall we say, among some of the younger generation. And Napoleon viewed himself as this, not only a black swan event, but a kind of larger than life personality who didn't have to follow anybody's rules. And so I talk about Napoleon really as the first romantic. And he's very much imitated by Byron, who comes right after him, Lord Byron, the great poet, who models himself after Napoleon, who had a carriage built for himself that was a copy of Napoleon's carriage that he used at Waterloo. And then after Byron died young at Missolonghi in Greece, Franz Liszt, the great pianist, modeled himself after both Napoleon and Byron, and that's why Liszt is often called the first Byronic figure in music. Very dashing, handsome. I've got mine. I'm the cock of the walk. I'm the big dog, and you are not. And that prototype, which begins with Napoleon, echoes throughout the 19th century. It really doesn't die until the First World War, until you get to the Battle of the Somme, and then there are no more heroes, starting with 1914. Anyway, it was a huge project. It was delayed somewhat by a serious illness that I had for the last 18 months or so, but I've managed to wrap it up and polish it up, and they're quite excited about it. So I'm thrilled. So those two books will be coming out within the next 12 months, both of them.
Well, I found them both fascinating. I mean, I love your short pieces, and I read quite a number of them. We'll try to get to some of those. But to stay on Napoleon, I'm currently reading a biography that Kevin Gutzman recommended of Marshall Ney.
Yeah.
So your talk and thoughts frame this a little bit better for me. It's going to be kind of, I think, more of an illuminating experience. The aspect of kind of bringing it forward a little bit of manhood and what that means, I think resonates throughout your work. I'm going to let you maybe touch on it more, but you talk about muscular Christianity, the Crusades, the Knights Templar, things about which you are far more expert than I and everybody else. Just understanding how Marshall Ney came to be and how he learned what to be and how he exemplified masculinity, manhood. It's not an obvious pattern. Even in his town growing up, I'm at the very, very beginning of the book, but he grew up in what's now Germany, and with what would be considered German lineage. He went to a German Catholic church and whatnot. There's this kind of this passing down, and the legacy that I think we're seeing an abrogation of currently. Your work is fascinating, but do people access it, and what is being lost when they don't have any kind of this kind of cultural literacy aspect? So in order, perhaps you can kind of talk about the Napoleonic part, but really the essence of manhood and what's being lost, and how does that play out in kind of the religious, cultural, political sphere currently?
I would say the more I think about this, the more I'm convinced that feminism has been had a wholly negative influence on culture, on men and women alike. It's certainly no one can say that the balance of the sexes or the war between the sexes is better now than it ever was in the past, because that's manifestly untrue. And we have the whole trans current fad to erase the lines between the sexes has always been part of the satanic left, as I call them, in the Devil's Pleasure Palace. They can't stand the world the way it is, so they must attack it, and that's critical theory. That book I've referenced now a couple times, Devil's Pleasure Palace, is a book about critical theory and the whole Marxist school of philosophers, the Frankfurt school, but puts it in a cultural context. I think young men don't know what to do around young women. Young women don't know what to do around young men. They treat each other hostilely now. It's been designed for maximum social disruption, and that's what we have. I think sexual segregation is probably going to be back. I mean, the left always ends up where it started. So it started off with, whether it's sexual segregation or racial segregation, they start off as against it, but they wind up for it. And as you know, now the left is all for, black courses only, black student events only, complete segregation reinstated at the highest levels of the Ivy League, which doesn't surprise me because I was in college from 67 to 71. So right in the belly of the beast when all of this kind of started to go sideways badly. They're horrible people, and their ideas are horrible, and yet we have never been strong enough to defeat them early enough so that they don't have a deleterious effect on the world economy and the world's life and just about everything. So I think that's been a real problem, is that the balance of the sexes is all wrong. I think things that women shouldn't do. I don't think they should be in the military, for example, ever, period. They can be in supporting units as they were during World War II, but as I say in the new book, if you have women fighting in your front lines, you're losing the war, and you will lose, because there's never been an army of women. Even with the famous Amazons from is it the Aeneid? I think they appear in that. They didn't really exist, and so that's bad. I think women in politics has proven to be a mixed blessing at best. I think that women tend to vote their emotions, and we all know this to be true, but you can't say it. But I'm saying it because what do I care? You look at voting patterns, single women who they don't have a man to depend on, so they depend on the government to be their substitute man. Vote leftist Democrat overwhelmingly. If they didn't vote, there'd never be another Democrat president, which sounds like a great idea to me. On the other hand, other people may disagree. So because of the 19th Amendment, when it was being passed, many women did not want to do it, and they predicted exactly what was going to happen, that it would become emotional, and that it would disrupt marriages. It would do all sorts of bad things, which have in fact happened. You can go back and read the literature at the time. But the 19th, like the 18th prohibition, was a largely Midwestern Protestant-driven notion, in part directed at the immigrant communities, who they were afraid of losing political power to. So the Irish had come first, and the Jews in the late 19th century, and also then the Italians right around the same time as the Jews. And with all of these people flooding into the cities, the Protestant ascendancy was quite concerned about a loss of political dominance. And they figured if they could double their vote, because a lot of the immigrants were single men, their wives would suddenly just do what they told them to do, and everything would be fine. Well, everything's not fine, and now you have a government of dependent females who are, in some cases, insane. And you see these Hamas protesters, for example, they're overwhelmingly female. Have you noticed that, Randy?
I have not done that part. No, I haven't. I mean, I kind of see that. I mean, there's been like these crazy, strip protests and, queers for Palestine, but I haven't done the head count.
Well, it looks very female when you see them screeching and screaming and shrieking. And I think if you went back to the last century, to the 19th century, rather, you would see them say, "I told you so." Anyway, this is a problem. It's not going to change. We're not going to repeal the 19th Amendment, although I put that up on Twitter constantly just to see how many people I can make highly agitated.
Are you familiar with, I can't find it right off the bat, but there's a meme that came back. It's a sign. It says, "I agree with Islam about women." Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't, except that I did make a point. I was on a podcast with two guys from Ace of Spades, JJ Sefton, who does the Morning Report, and CBD. And I said, Islam is the most male-centric religion. It doesn't let women do anything. And that's very attractive, I think, in many ways. And it's attractive to women. That's the funny part, because the women realize that the man is there to control every aspect of their lives. And deep down inside, many of them want that. They'd like a little more liberty and a little more latitude. But I think part of Islam's success has been that it takes sexual temptation out of the equation, basically, by, like the Orthodox Jews do, by severely restricting what the women can wear, how they have to dress, where they have to sit, etc. And those two faiths are doing quite well.
It is ironic that we see our, say, liberated women, or women on the left, whatever, aligning with Hamas, which, to use kind of the Spanish word, Hamas, that would be them under Hamas. It would be no more of them. They would be the first to go. And oddly enough, that it's getting back to women in the military and so forth. The men who came across the border from Gaza were were not gender confused.
No.
They were literally rapacious, and
they were all men too. There weren't any
yes,
women doing
all
it
men,
involved.
all
Yeah.
men, and they took the women as prizes and worse, rape and etc. The Israeli military, they pride themselves in having universal conscription. But there, if you go into Gaza, I don't think there are women fighting for the Israelis. I think it would be a horrible mistake to have them, because that is for whom you are fighting.
Yes. Well, we're not supposed to say that, but that's the truth. And the Israelis don't put women in their front lines. At least they didn't used to. Maybe they've made that error now, which they'll correct, no doubt, as soon as they can. But you have, like I say, if you have women fighting in your front lines, you're losing. And the Arabs that are attempting to erase Israel from the map and push the Jews into the sea, as they so blatantly say, they're not gender confused. They know who fights and who doesn't. I'll give you an example from the Crusades. At one point, at the Battle of Dorylaeum, which was the first encounter between the real Crusaders, there had been a prior crusade to the first one run by amateurs and peasants, and it was all wiped out by the Turks almost immediately that it arrived in Asia Minor. But the first one, the first battle was at even then it was a ruined city called Dorylaeum. And Bohemond, who's the subject of this long chapter, and his nephew Tancred, who appears in many medieval stories, poems, legends, etc., after the First Crusade, Tancred. Tancred. They're leading the avant-garde, and they're ambushed by the Turks. And in these caravans that they would take across the wastes of Anatolia, what's now central Turkey, there were lots of women. There were camp followers, there were prostitutes, there were children, there were many, many dependents. So your warriors had to protect them as well as protect themselves. And the Turks shouted them along the ranges, almost like American Indians, shadowing a wagon train, and then came swooping down. They were very mobile. They rode fast ponies. They had these light composite bows, so they would right up, shoot, and then immediately turn away. And the knights couldn't get mounted on their big European horses. And although the Europeans were much bigger physically than the Turks, and the Turks were very, very afraid of the Crusaders because they were huge, and one cut of their sword could split a Turk from head to toe. So they gave them as far a big a berth as they could. But at one point, the Turks broke through the shield wall because the Crusaders had to go into a defensive position, having been ambushed. And the minute they broke through the shield wall, the women stopped helping the Crusaders and put on their finery and offered themselves to the Turks and said, "Take us to the harems." The minute it happened. So in other words, my thesis being that when women feel their own men cannot protect them, they will find others who can. That's why it doesn't make any sense, because they're not thinking about sense. They're thinking about who can protect me, who can take care of me. I know all this sounds terribly retrograde, and no doubt I'll come in for a beating on it, but I believe that history shows I'm right. Now, once Bowman rallied the troops, the women all immediately got back into line and started carrying water to the soldiers and carrying off the dead and the wounded. And they did all that, but their first instinct was the battle is lost, we go over to the Turks immediately. So this, of course, is the antithesis of my book, Last Stands, which was about how men fight literally to the last man. They will not give up. And yet the women give up instantaneously. It's a problem.
It is a problem. We currently have a vice president to an octogenarian, Kamala Harris. I don't see much Margaret Thatcher in her.
Well, you don't see much Margaret Thatcher in anybody. I mean, people keep saying, well, what about Margaret Thatcher? Margaret Thatcher's one in a million. You might as well say, what about Queen Elizabeth I? That was 500 years ago, for God's sakes. It's a silly argument to say, Yeah, but not all. Yes, of course, but not all. I accept there's going to be exceptions to everything. But when you make policy, you don't make it on the exception, you make it on the rule. And if you have a rational society, you bet the odds. A bookie can tell you that, right? Only a fool bets the short money all the time. Now, once in a while it'll pay off, but you will go broke long before it does.
I got into similar trouble to yours, but on a minor scale, on a thread about Armenia, the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict of last year.
Yeah.
There was a story, a picture of a frontline woman, Armenian soldier, and she was taken out of her, wherever she was, shooting from, turret or something, and horrible things happened. Misery ensued on a physical basis immediately, et cetera, et cetera. And I made a point similar to yours, like, this is not a place for her. It gives the opportunity to the enemy. And everyone went on about how the Azerbaijanis had this Muslim, streak, scimitar, death, defilement, rape, pillage, etc. And it's like, yeah, sure, okay, fine. But if you know that's your enemy, what are you doing putting your women soldiers on the front line? Now, that may have been a desperation moment. I might have, misread. I mean, based on the post, that's what it was. Who knows what actually was? But people just, I don't know, they can't really hear it. And again, emotion takes over for judgment oftentimes. But I got called names. Okay, fine. That's bad, getting called names. But even worse is putting your women on the front line and having them, meet that type of fate.
Well, especially with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a largely Muslim country, and Armenia is famously a Christian country. It's managed to stay Christian in the toughest neighborhood on the planet forever. So they're quite proud of it. But the religious element adds even more animosity to it than it would if they were both co-religionists, say, like the Iranians and the Iraqis.
Well, they did bad things to each other as well. I was in Armenia about 7 years ago, and they're basically just kind of a little bit of a ripe pear held by a little thread to Asian Georgia, and surrounded by enemy, quasi-enemy. I mean, Iran is maybe a cold enemy, but they've got Turkey on the left, Azerbaijan on the right. Seems like a very similar situation to Israel. How do these things, survive? Is there still any kind of muscular Christianity? Do people care? You talk about going back into a kind of a pagan mode before things will get better. I mean, I can't remember the name of that cycle. Soft men, hard times. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yeah. I don't want to repeat it, but yeah, it's that bad times create hard men create good times create soft men create bad times that create hard men again. It goes in a circle. But Armenia is kind of like Israel, and Armenians are very, very proud of being Christian. Their Christianity is among the oldest versions of the Christian faith on the planet. I suppose the only older ones would be found in what's now Syria. Syria. Remember, all these Muslim countries were the birthplaces of Christianity. Israel clearly is a Jewish country, but Lebanon, all Israel is the old kingdom of Israel, the Crusader kingdom of Israel. And way back before that, the two kingdoms of Jerusalem and Judah repeated again. And then Lebanon, if you look at the Crusader states, would be the county of Tripoli. As for the rest of, there were Christians in Egypt. The Copt Christians are still there, and their Christianity goes way back. Syriac Christianity in Iraq. All these countries have been purged of both Christians and Jews, as you know. So these large Jewish communities. Baghdad had a huge Jewish community at one point. Very wealthy families came from Baghdad, and some of them, I worked on a project with the great Mike Medavoy, producer in Los Angeles. And Mike, who's Jewish, had been born in Shanghai, China, when it became a Jewish ghetto during the war. The the Germans wanted, the Japanese had captured China, as they do anytime they want to, basically, and they owned Shanghai, and Shanghai was funnily structured. So there was a British section, there was an American section, there was a French section, and then there was the Chinese section of Shanghai. And rather than kill the Jews, because the Japanese had no quarrel with the Jews, they stuffed them all into Chinese homes in the Chinese ghetto quarter and walled it off. So this is where my friend Mike Medavoy grew up. But as we were researching this, I got to know there were several families, the Sassoons, for example. The Vidal Sassoon comes from this long line of Baghdadi Jews who had gone to Shanghai or India in the commercial trading centers like Goa or Shanghai, and then it eventually come to Western Europe and the United States. It's very interesting part of Jewish history we don't hear very much of. But that Baghdadi Jewish community is long gone, as is the Baghdadi Christian community.
Yeah, I think there are 2 Jews in Yemen.
Yeah.
And that had a fairly large grouping at, till 47 to 8, whatever. So it's just, people get up in arms about ethnic cleansing and toxic masculinity, and yet they side with Hamas. What would be the next step after Hamas were to take this? I mean, we see these uprisings, which don't seem necessarily controllable throughout Europe. The Eastern Europe countries have perhaps the best, most coherent national identity, but you're holed up in Ireland, and you're probably in a place that hasn't quite filtered. But there obviously have been issues throughout Western Europe. I saw somebody got prosecuted for saying Irish lives matter in Ireland. Do they not matter?
Well, in my little village here of 500 people, we have 900 Ukrainians. They just appeared one day. So you do the math. It's a problem all over the country. The Irish government is devoted to replacing, they won't admit it because that's a right-wing, far right, sorry, everybody who's conservative is far right. It's a far right conspiracy theory. But they're bringing in people from Central Africa, Afghanistan, Roma gypsies from Romania, and Ukrainians. And it's increased population by over 1 million people in the last couple of years. And they showed absolutely no signs of wanting to stop. So the Irish people, the real Irish people, are protesting it, but I don't think they're going to get very far.
Your prime minister there is an unusual case. Does he last? What's his name? Leo?
His name is Leo Varadkar. He's homosexual, proudly out proud gay, married to some lawyer or something. I think he's an American, or
Doctor,
at least
I thought he was a doctor.
Yeah, well, no, Leo is a doctor theoretically.
Okay.
So he's half Indian. His father is from India, and his mother was Irish. So that's the current Taoiseach, as we say here, prime minister.
So people seem to be chosen for their external characteristics, their last names. Joe Biden famously limited his search to Black women, and whether Kamala Harris is one is another question. She's, I think, half Indian also.
Yeah.
But how did that happen in Ireland? I grew up thinking it was a pretty Catholic place.
It was, but it's not anymore. It's deinstitutionalized the church, and it's become pagan. I remember I was doing a show with Mark Stein once years ago and talking about Britain, and Mark said, it was an early one, a cable TV show, and Mark said to me, well, Britain's a wholly godless country now. And I was surprised by that, but he was absolutely right. Well, Ireland is now as well. They've deinstitutionalized the church. They've run it to ground, and the church has nobody to blame but itself. Leo was never elected by anybody. He was a backbencher, and the previous prime minister quit, and he was elevated into that spot. So no one voted for him, but he's sitting there nice and pretty. He's a World Economic Forum Klaus Schwab guy, young leader of the future kind of guy. He's all in on the European project, and it's been a very bad thing for Ireland. Ireland never should have joined the EU. It should have joined a kind of Anglo alliance with Britain and all the English-speaking countries, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But it chose to stay in the EU after Brexit, and this causes all kinds of difficulties with the border or lack of border with Northern Ireland, for example. It's just mischief on a vast scale that is rapidly spiraling out of control. It's a beautiful place. I love here. I rebuilt my great grandmother's birthplace, so all my neighbors are blood relatives, but it's not that way the rest of the country.
You know, H.L. Mencken said democracy is the principle by which the people vote for what they want and they deserve to get it, good and hard.
Yeah. Or someone said you can vote your way into socialism, but you have to shoot your way out of it.
Yeah, and I think Churchill said
one vote, one time. That's it. Ireland voted for the Lisbon Treaty, which theoretically, which admitted it to the EU, which has an out clause. Ireland can leave anytime they want, but they will never, ever, ever invoke that clause. And they've done their best to bury it in the memory of the people.
Could you please tell me what that is?
The Lisbon Treaty was part of the series of legal steps that took to bring various countries into the European Union. So Ireland was a holdout and rejected the Lisbon Treaty the first time. That would have brought Ireland into the EU. Ireland has been, as you know, proudly isolationist and neutral since its very brief period of independence from the Brits, starting in the 1930s after the revolution against the English and then the Civil War in Ireland. And it's too much boring Irish history, but it became a free state, so part of the British Commonwealth, and then it became an independent country. And during World War II, it was neutral, so it took no side on anything. Like Sweden, it was neutral, or Switzerland. But now it's got troops in NATO, and it's rapidly beginning to forget that part of it. But the Lisbon Treaty gave Ireland an out clause, which said, if you want to leave, you can vote again and leave. And the first time they voted on that treaty, it was rejected. So with the left, you know, they never stop. So when you put up a thing and it gets voted down, they'll be back 3 or 4 years later with the same thing. They'll call it something different, but it'll be the same thing. And they insist that you keep voting until you get it their way, and then they stop, and then there's no more voting. So
yeah, one man, one vote, one time.
One time, that's it. So, like for example, California, there's Gail Harriet has got something going on Twitter where California's turned down an attempt to legalize racial discrimination, pro-affirmative action. It was an affirmative action thing California said no to. Well, they're back again. They want to do it again. But this time they've worded it in another way. You know, they're devils and they never quit.
So I was probably, I always see things as the before times, before COVID. So when there were networking parties and whatnot, I was running a small kind of tech sideline business. And I was at a networking event, and they were promoting Catalonia and all these Catalan businesses and whatnot. And they wanted to have their own ambassador, their own consulate and so forth. And they're part of Spain. And I wanted, and they're like, well, we're working towards independence because we're Catalan, da, da, da. We have our own language. I get it. I've been in Barcelona, and I get it.
Yeah.
But it's like, so what's your first step when you become independent? They're like, oh, we're joining the EU. Like, how does that work for your independence thing? And it seems like Ireland worked so hard for its, and then you have all this kind of Irish separatism and in the north and whatnot. And so you hated the British so much, but you love Brussels? I mean, how does that all work out?
I've been saying this for years. You had 700 years of slavery under the British, which most Americans don't realize how bad that was. They took away the language. They took away your property rights. You couldn't vote. They outlawed your religion. They killed your priests. They confiscated your property. They tore down your houses around your head. And they had 700 plus years of this. And then they got their liberty, and they couldn't wait to rush into the arms of the Belgians, of all the people on the planet who everybody makes fun of and laughs at, the Belgians are right up there. And yet, it's not really the Belgians, of course, it's the Germans and the French. But it's situated in Brussels, and that's where all the laws get made. So now that here people say, why doesn't the national government reflect the wishes of the people? And I tell them, that's not its job. Its job is to do what the EU tells it to do. That's its job. You think you're voting for a prime minister, but you're not. You're voting for your representative to take orders from Brussels. That's it. Welcome to the new world. That's it. You got it. But nobody thought this.
It always seems like a nose under the tent. I forget who it was. I think maybe somebody Gallagher, who was a professor, a law professor, whatever. She wrote about the gay marriage concept. Sick, such as it is. At the time, it was happening or beginning to happen from Massachusetts onward. And she said, well, what you're going to see is, and she gave a bunch of other. It's not about gay marriage. It's about institutionalizing the concept and having it have equal footing in biology class. So you will have to learn all the wherewithal of what constitutes these relationships, and it's no longer going to be just, what you might think of your old biology class and whatever else other class, civics and whatnot. It's going to be a full incorporation in the logos and the direction of your society, and I think we see this as well. Barack Obama said elections have consequences, but even non-elections do. You can't do stuff anymore. I apologize for going on, but I've had on my show David Makareth, who's a Christian medical doctor, and it's odd and inimical to what people think of spirituality and Christianity. Hocus pocus and believing in myths and whatnot. That he is so hugely grounded in biology. He is a medical doctor, and he's doing emergency, so forth. They have a different, I think they call it A&E or something like that. But he can't do that anymore because he thinks that men are men and women are women, and that come into his office, they can do whatever they want out in the parade and promenade and whatnot, and be and have parties and whatnot. He's not limiting their mobility activity or anything like that. But a little bit like the baker. Didn't want to do a cake. You're coming to my medical office. You either have a prostate or you don't.
Yeah.
These are huge differentials in medicine. We don't do pregnancy tests on men, and he's lost every level. I think it went to some European Commission as well. I don't know whether he tried to get a license elsewhere, but he's lost in every single level. He's done apparently with legal recourse, and here it is Christianity that has, I think, a firmer hold on the science.
Yeah, it's the woman you're thinking of is Maggie Gallagher, and she was out against gay marriage from the start, and for a long time she was winning, and then of course once the Massachusetts Supreme Court decided the issue, that was the dam that broke, and that was the end of it. And Maggie, of course, lost all of the moral leverage that she had. What they do doesn't surprise me because there is no end to what they will do, which is why principles are important and why barriers are there for a reason. It's Chesterton's fence, of course, that whole the paradigm of that. In Hollywood, you go into meetings and you constantly hear, well, we want to push the envelope and break boundaries. Well, you go, why? What does that actually mean? Well, you see what it means. If you can see the last 3 years of Netflix, you know what it means. Maggie Gallagher was right in that there is no limiting principle on the left. Once they push through the fence, Chesterton's fence, they will go as far as they can go. They will take it to the negation of the negation, and they'll be back where they started. This is like what I was saying earlier about segregation. They'll be against it, and then they'll immediately reinstate it under a different principle. So Chesterton's fence, for the listeners who are not aware of this, is a parable that G.K. Chesterton, the Catholic British writer and thinker, mentions. Is to two guys are walking in a field and they come across a fence, and one guy says, "Let's tear the fence down." And the other guy says, "Wait a minute, why? Do you know why that fence is there? Does it have a reason? Shouldn't we maybe find out the reason why that fence is there before we just tear it down?" And of course, the left is the guy that wants to tear it down because it seems to them to be arbitrary and capricious and ridiculous. And then they tear the fence down and Godzilla eats them, something like that. The lion eats them. But whatever it was keeping out was crucial. You just couldn't see it. So this is where we are now. Every Chestertonian fence has been taken down. And the result is the society that you see. I mean, they just closed a school in Brooklyn, high school.
I saw that.
Because
So
they're
they
going to
put
put
1,900 migrants. And I was just puzzled. Why doesn't Eric Adams, bus the Americans to Honduras and Venezuela? Because likely they have a lot of empty schools down there for all people fleeing here. I mean, wouldn't that be like it's the great replacement? I guess they could just, but they're doing remote learning, as it were.
That worked out so well during COVID.
Yeah, and they just come up with one oxymoron phrase after another. Remote learning being one of them. I have to just you're talking about the wall of the border, the fence and whatnot, had me thinking. I was actually assaulted by the technical term. I wasn't beaten up or anything like that, but at my own club, we play squash, we play tennis, and this was squash season, so we're playing literally against walls. There are 4 of them. Without which you can't play squash. And at the time, I forget what was, some, the situation was horrible as usual. And it was one of the intifada moments or whatever. And I think it was the election of Donald Trump. And so I got screamed at we're dressing, we'd played a game, whatever. I got screamed at that wall. Donald Trump wanted to make a wall, and that's horrible. Walls don't work, and so forth. I'm like, hold on just a second. We were just playing squash. Did the walls work in squash? Like, you know what I mean? I'm like, okay, all right. So let's think about a wall. They had the intifada. That's what I was thinking. First, second, pick your intifada. And after, I think the second one, they built, kind of a wall segment in East Jerusalem or something like that. And the number of deaths, of Jewish deaths, went down, a factor of, order of magnitude or more. And did that wall work? It's like, at any rate, I was like, Mexico has its own wall with Guatemala. They have a border fence.
Yeah.
What do you have one in your house? Do you have walls in your house? We were leaving, and he turned and assaulted me. I'm not going to get into details. I lived, of course I have left with a face like this. But there's no logic there.
They're not logical. They're emotional. That's the whole point. They're emotional. The left wants things the way they want it, no matter what contravening reality steps in. Hungary has a wall. They had a bunch of refugees march through Hungary one year when I go there quite a bit, was there. And now they put up a wall. Now they have no refugees coming through. And they've said to the European Union, we will not take them. That's it. We will not.
That puts them on the far right.
Take them. So they're far right Nazis.
They're on the far right of their own wall.
Yeah. So yeah, walls do work. Good Lord, if the Romans didn't have walls, where would they be? They, as I mentioned, Caesar at the Battle of Alesia, they built 2 walls. They built first of all the Vercingetorix and his principal army were holed up in this hilltop town called Alesia, Alesia, and Caesar came to finish this fight that he was the end of the Gallic Wars. The first thing he did is he did a circumvallation. He built a wall all around the thing. So this trapped Vercingetorix inside the city, and pretty soon starvation was setting in, and disease, and all sorts of sicknesses. And Caesar was, standing outside his wall, and the Celts, the Gauls, sent the women and children into the no man's land between Alesia town and the Roman wall, thinking the Romans would take them in. Of course not. They let them starve to death right in front of the Gauls. And while this was all happening, Vercingetorix managed to smuggle out word that he needed help, and another big Celtic army was formed and came at Caesar. So he built another wall. So now Caesar's in the middle of 2 walls. He's got Celts on the outside of the one, and he's got them on the inside of the second wall. And that's how he won that battle. by, first of all, starving out the Celts under Vercingetorix and being able to defeat the larger Celtic army, the larger Gallic army, because he took advantage the same way the Greeks did at Thermopylae. This gets back to the themes of my book, how these things rhyme, that he had to man the whole wall, obviously, against the incoming Celts. But he knew that they would have to break through at one point. So he could concentrate his forces there. And that negated the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Celts on the outside of that wall, because then they have to fight basically 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, which is how the Greeks held off the Persians at Thermopylae, because it was such a narrow little pass that you could only squeeze a few men through it. So Caesar was able to defeat those Gauls, and then that caused Vercingetorix to surrender. And so, meanwhile, all the women and children are lying dead. Romans didn't care. Why would they? They weren't Christians, that's for sure. And Caesar took Vercingetorix captive, and he took him to Rome and put him in a prison for 7 years, and then he brought him out at a triumph and had him strangled publicly. That's how the Romans handled these things. We don't have the guts to do it, but we don't want to win. And Caesar wanted to win.
That's the thing about winning. Getting back to the Israel situation, they're not allowed to win. They're not starving out Hamas.
They have to win.
When they were starving out Hamas, they were winning.
Yes.
When they stopped starving out Hamas, and people say it's humanitarian relief for the Palestinians in Gaza, but it is hijacked and it's basically food towards Hamas and the power to them, because they distribute it. The ones with the guns are the ones with the food. And if you want to get some, you better do your stuff. You better do their bidding. So that now becomes just a grind. They're not allowed to win a war. Other countries are allowed to win wars.
Yeah, but Israel. Here's the thing, Randy. Israel has to stop depending on the United States. If I were Jewish and an Israeli, I would find it insulting in the way I find the expression Judeo-Christianity insulting, in that it's a negative about the Judeo part, because it implies that Christianity is the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures that the Jews were too dumb not to accept at the time. That's what it really means. So I think Israel needs to just say goodbye to Uncle Sugar. I think Israel is viewed correctly, in my opinion, by all the Arabs as a U.S. client state. And it is a U.S. client state. If it wasn't for all that money that we pour in, it would be in a very difficult position. But a smart Israeli leader would begin to wean him or herself, if we had, speaking of exceptions, like
Golda
Meir, yes, wean themselves from American public opinion, American government opinion, especially the Democrats.
Yeah, but the thing comes down to, you do that, and then who's going to be supplying your metals and fuels and this and that? I mean, Israel, again, has a lot of ingenuity, but I don't think they have the, they don't have the breadth and resources to do all that. So where do you buy your stuff?
They have to not care about the American opinion. That's what they have to do, because they have to win that war with some finality. They have to go Roman on Hamas. It has to be utterly destroyed. Utterly destroyed.
Well, that ship may have sailed.
Unfortunately, I think it has, and so you know what will happen? Nothing.
Another one.
And then this will happen again, and then we'll go through the same stupid conversation 10 years from now. That's what will happen.
Right.
And it will never stop until some Jewish leader gets all Joshua there and decides.
Or the other guys win. Yeah, or the other guys win.
Or the other guys win. And that's what you're looking at. Nobody who wants to live in a country that's constantly under bombardment. Nobody. The Jews will all move to Florida, for God's sakes. They'll say enough of this. Right. But so we have to, I think America has to walk a tightrope with Israel to not seem like we're completely in the tank for it. And at the same time, because the Israelis, they have to do what they have to do. They spy on us all the time. Everybody knows that. They spy on us the way the Soviets spied on us and the way the East Germans spied on us. Because
the Chinese are doing it right now.
Well, but that's okay. We accept that. I just think that they've got to take the bull by the horns here, and however they can. I realize it's an impossible situation.
Okay,
And I'm not advocating abandoning Israel. I'm just saying,
I
I think
understand.
the less we Bigfoot it there, the better it is for
Well,
the.
under times of war, it's hard for them to get stuff to shoot with, and they, are trying to be, friendly bombs, smart bombs, or those are expensive. They run out pretty quick. Iran doesn't do that. Iran, buys hearts and souls and suicide bombers.
Hmm.
It's asymmetric war. But just to kind of get back to something you mentioned before we kind of close this out,
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your Judeo-Christian formulation a little more carefully.
Sure. Well, I just think I've spent years on this subject as I was researching the Constantine chapter in the new book. I think most Christians don't realize that the early Christians had to do two things regarding the Jews. One was, first of all, you had to be a Jew to be a Christian. And St. Paul was the first one who said, that stuff about circumcision, forget about it. And that stuff about ham and cheese sandwiches, forget about that too, because the Greeks just weren't going to get circumcised and they loved ham and cheese sandwiches. So he opened it up to the Gentiles. He was the apostle to the Gentiles because he was a Hellenized Jew himself. But what they did, the early church fathers with the Tanakh, is to rearrange the books of the Tanakh, especially the prophecy books. So the major prophets in the Christian version of the Old Testament are at the end, not in the middle, the way they are in the Jewish Bible. So, whereas in the Jewish Bible, God, Adonai, Elohim, Yahweh, whatever you want to call him, vanishes effectively from the Jewish Bible with Job after he's essentially beaten by Job, and Satan too, by the way, but that makes that book very piquant, vanishes. Whereas the Christians said, well, we can't have a God that disappears, and we can't have a bunch of prophecies that didn't come true because the state of Israel was not reborn, and none of that stuff that the old prophets had prophesied came true. So they moved it to the end of the Old Testament. And that's why you have Christianity in the first 300 or 400 years pretzeling itself to prove that those prophecies didn't apply to the temporal world, they applied to the spiritual world, and therefore Jesus of Nazareth is the fulfillment of those prophecies. So the Christian version of the Old Testament ends with he's coming, and then the first book of the Bible, which was written by Matthew, who was the most Jewish of the four evangelists, picks up on that theory and the point that Jesus is the Messiah. So I think Judeo-Christianity is, the two faiths are different faiths. They're not the same faith, and I don't think that they have a lot to do with each other once you look at the history of what their relationship is. Clearly, Judaism is a spiritual father to Christianity, but Christianity is in effect a rejection of Judaism at the most basic level. And the other thing I would just mention quickly is that the Romans had lots of tolerance for other religions. They never tried to stamp out religions, and their beef with the Jews was never about religion. It was about rebellion. They didn't like rebels. So the Maccabees and the Sicarii and all of the roiling that was going on in the first 20 years of the AD, now we call it, was because the Jews were political, and that's why the temple was destroyed by Titus, and then Hadrian later on, and the Bar Kokhba revolt. Let's see what I was. I've lost my train of thought here because I got wrapped up in all of this history. Yes, I know what it was. The Romans they didn't like new religions, so they'd stamp them out because they were nothing but trouble. And Christianity realized that its only way to prevent that persecution, it happened, but real persecution of Christians didn't start happening until almost before Constantine, so the Vespasian. So that's very late in the 3rd century, moving into the 4th century. But the Christians could say, hey, we're just Jews by another name, that we are tied to Judaism. We have this history that goes back as far as the ancient Greek Hesiod and the Theogony, back to the first books of the Bible. So the Romans comped them in. Nero blamed the fire on the Christians and made lamps out of some of them and set them on fire. That's true. But it wasn't a systemic persecution the way it became later. And Christianity needed Judaism in order to go under its shield. And as I say, the early days of Christianity, you had to be Jewish. So you had to basically become circumcised and observe the Mosaic law. And there was a whole subset of Christians that went on for hundreds of years called the Ebionites, who were basically the first Jews for Jesus. And they became heretical, of course, as Christianity developed. And they lived out in the desert somewhere and eventually died out. But there were many different sects that kind of combined Judaism and Christianity until you get to Orthodox Christianity at the Council of Nicaea in 325, I think it is. It's very complex. Nothing is as simple. I think this is what I would say as a historian. Nothing is as simple as it seems to us, having inherited only the story but not the facts.
Well, we see it now. If you talk about January 6th, depends to whom you speak. You'll get completely different versions of what the history is. Ronald Reagan said, I was talking about the left, he said, it's not that they're ignorant, it's just that so much of what they know is wrong.
Is wrong, yeah.
And so it's a matter of, dissecting the history. I was never a history guy. I liked, I guess I liked right and wrong, and I was chemistry, physics, mathematics, that kind of stuff. So this is all somewhat new to me, and I'm really fascinated by your exegesis, no pun intended. I think exegesis is a great word because it reminds me of the X, the cross of Jesus.
Yeah.
As a word. So I've always thought of that as a visual pun word, but nobody else gets it because nobody knows what exegesis is, pretty much. Anyway, so much is lost, but I'm happy that you are continuing to churn it and excavate it and bring it anew. So I recommend people go follow you. You are on Twitter. Your name is easy to spell. They can find you, Michael Walsh, and here's the Devil's Pleasure Palace, which they can purchase for euros, dollars, or any other currency last stands we have here. And against the Great Reset, I think, I've followed you for ages. We didn't get a chance to talk about your alter ego from Hollywood. Maybe if you would be willing to indulge me, we'll try that again.
Sure, we'll do that some other time. Yeah, they can follow our website, which is thepipeline.org.
Right. Right. I didn't even get to
the-pipeline.org, and we publish one story a day. It's mostly about climate change, anti-fossil fuel, anti-oil, electric car insanity. It's all of the sort of how those things are all wrapped up. And we have a very distinguished group of. There's one. This is Lisa Schifrin, who Lisa yourself.
Lisa Schifrin is wonderful.
Yeah. So we're there 7 days a week. And you can follow me on Twitter, X at @theamanuensis. So there's another good word. TheAMANU and EUSIS. Yeah. Yep. Which means someone who writes for somebody else under a secret name. And that I started when I was writing as David Kahane for National Review back in the early 21st century.
Yeah, you were the conduit for yourself, were you not?
I was, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I'd love to get over that because I go over that at some point because let's see. Here we go, Michael. I'll just pull it up for everybody to find.
Sure. Yeah.
So here it is.
Sure.
If you're looking on spelling it, it's going to have probably if you just put some of your book titles in, you'll find this.
Yeah, the amanuensis.
Yeah. And just as parting words, I like to tell people how they might be able to support my efforts here in my podcast. And Michael Walsh and I are almost exactly the same. He's got 1,000 books and I've got one.
Well, there you go.
This is nothing to do with really any of those topics, perhaps in the sense of what becomes history. And my book's called Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's a fascinating story. I'm going to leave it there, let people kind of search it out.
I didn't realize you were a medical doctor, Andy. I didn't. It's good to know. Yeah.
Otherwise, my name is just Randall S. Bach. My name is Mark. It does stand for that. Actually, I was in Rochester from a medical degree.
Oh, did you intern at Strong, or what did you do?
No. Well, I did clerkships there. I graduated in 1981. I loved Rochester. It was a great time. Mostly, entire time lived on South Avenue, which is a couple blocks away. Had a wonderful time there, and it was pleasantly gray.
Yeah.
There. It was perfect weather for studying because it rained so much.
I went to the Eastman School of Music, and they said, enjoy the fall weather for 2 days because you'll be indoors for the next 6 months, and you have no excuse not to practice, basically.
Well, that's true. I mean, I think it was a reasonable proposition. And if I'd been, I don't know, University of San Diego or something like that, I think it would have been harder to study. Even so, we're left with this. Anyway, the Zika story, just for my audience, the Zika story is a fascinating thing. It was there in 2015. It disappeared, and nobody within the medical world, all your journals, all your established doctors, infectious disease sort will even bother to think that maybe the original theory was not correct. Ordinarily with science, Richard Feynman, says, science is not science unless you have a provable hypothesis and you can prove it over and over again independently within the world. And this clearly isn't. But the weird excuses are just incredible. They're basically dog ate my homework kind of excuses that medical establishment had of why it's disappeared. They saw some other strain, this and that. There's instant immunity. It's an amazing thing. I recommend people read it. Well, at least buy it. They can at least buy it. If they read it, that's even awesome. So thank you so much.
I'll buy it today. So there.
Oh, perfect. Well, that'll increase my readership. I'm not going to say by what percent, but we're taking over the world. I mean, I think it's an amazing. I started before COVID, and then COVID kind of prevented people from, having any brain space on pandemics to look at this. But had it been out early enough, I think people would have had a much more skeptical, beneficial viewpoint of what the experts say. There you have it.
Well, you never know about books. I mean, they'll suddenly come back to life. It's a very
and I saw this as a planting a flag on the moon kind of thing. At some point, 5-10 years from now, when there's still no more Zika, they have kind of one of my favorite doctors who's working on a Zika vaccine now. She doesn't call it this. I've called this. She basically has a locust theory that she thinks is because there was like an episode of Guillain-Barré, it's unrelated to the Zika 7 years before. Then this happens, going to be another 7 years. Now her 7 years has passed, but so she thinks it's going to be this kind of episode. Maybe 17 years later, it'll show up and that'll prove it. But in the meanwhile, there's no theory there.
Okay.
So thank you so much for being on. I appreciate your time and indulgence.
It's my pleasure.
And I learned a lot, frankly, and I stand to learn a lot more. I've read Victor Davis Hanson's Battlefield books, and I've got to pick up yours.
Good. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for watching.
Bye.